So I spent my last video advising anyone who would listen to not buy the 2008 reboot of Prince of Persia, but to instead look to Metal Gear Rising for your sword-based jumping around antics. Which is all well and good, unless you're craving some platforming and light puzzling from your sword-focused frivolity. Well, assuming you have either a PlayStation 2 lying around or a PC that is at least 10 years old, there is an alternative, or rather 3 alternatives, which I will now talk about in the order that I played them after buying them all a couple of weeks ago. The Sands of Time Trilogy of Prince of Persia games were a pretty big deal back in the day, or at least I saw them as a big deal. The Sands of Time set a new standard for 3D platforming, combining good controls, graphics, sound design, voice acting, basically everything but the combat, which gets pretty repetitive pretty quickly, and you know it. You start as the prince himself, and after being tricked into opening the Sands of Time by some sort of pantomime villain vizier, everyone except you and a stripper of some sort are turned into sand monsters. These monsters will not die until you finish them off with your special time-travelling dagger, which was a mechanic I quite liked at first, but when the fights start including higher numbers of stronger enemies, each with attack combos that can stun lock you into death, it gets to be a bit of a pain. In fact, combat in general gets pretty tiresome here. You can clear a room of enemies only to have to sit through another 2 or 3 waves of them, with a limited moveset not offering much variety. The time manipulation mechanics are what really set this game apart when it was released though. When you mess up a jump and plummet to your death, or get crushed by a rock, or chopped into pieces by an enemy you didn't spot, just hold down a button and you'll call backsies to get another go at it. You can also slow down time to allow you more breathing room during combat. You can freeze enemies into sand, cause area of effect explosions, all sorts of time and sand based hijinks. Of course these abilities are limited to a maximum of 6 uses, but these are refilled by collecting sand from fallen enemies or sometimes finding breakable items scattered around the levels. Before we carry on though, I feel like I should come clean here. The Sands of Time was the only game in the trilogy that I didn't play when it was originally released. I only just played it for the first time a couple of weeks ago, so I have no nostalgic attachment to this game. I see many people hold this game as the best in the series, which it may well be, but unfortunately the PC port I played had a pretty glaring issue which tarnished the experience for me. Now, this game features full mouse and keyboard support, which is nice for the option I suppose, but this is the default control scheme, and for a third-person platformer that just doesn't sit right with me. It feels weird. So while you can use a controller here, you do have to manually assign every action to a button, which is frankly tedious. Luckily though, it was easy enough to find templates online suggesting what actions should be assigned to which buttons to match that of the original console release. However, one thing it doesn't do is read the analog sticks properly. If the camera is positioned directly behind the prince, pushing the left stick all the way forward, back, left or right will make the prince jog in that direction, as it should. Push it in a diagonal direction, however, and he walks slowly, which in some instances isn't really an issue, but throw in some timed puzzles and a camera that will swap position all by itself, meaning its idea of what direction diagonal is has changed, and you have some problems which can all but put a stop to your playthrough. I got 4 hours into the game before the broken movement controls and lengthy repetitive combat sections got the better of me, and I quit. Maybe I'd have been able to push through if I had some of that sweet nostalgic nectar to look forward to, but I didn't. It also didn't help that when a tutorial text popped up, it wouldn't recognise the 360 controller I was using, so it would tell me to press button 6 while holding button 3 to do a move. What the hell is button 6? I don't know. What I'm trying to say is this game certainly still seems good, but the problems introduced by using modern controller technology hold it back. Which is a shame, as I'd always wanted to play this game. But if you still have a PS2, or the original game on CD and an emulator, this will still be as playable as it was on release, I imagine. But the combat is still boring, sorry, I don't think any controls will change that. So now we move on to the most controversial entry in the trilogy, Warrior Within. Released a year after the Sands of Time back in 2004, we see a game with a much darker and pretty edgy sort of tone. Instead of the bright colours and the sounds of Arabian Nights, we have the dark imagery and soundtrack of a Godsmack concert. And that's literally, that riff is played over and over again. Talk about a one-hit wonder band. That song was everywhere back then. Anyway, all the Arabian deserty soundtrack has been replaced with guitar riffs and drum fills. Enemies now bleed and can be decapitated, cut in half both vertically and horizontally, or be choked to death from behind. This very much seems like some older men in a boardroom wanted to target the teenagers with this one. with nu metal still just about being a real thing at the time. Now, as this was my first Prince of Persia game, I didn't have any issue with this tone at the time of first playing it. Even now, I don't think the tone is really a problem in itself, but it just seems so out of place with the rest of the series and the fact it has the Prince of Persia name on it. And the loading screen dripping with blood is a bit too try-hard for my liking. But the game does try its best to justify the darker tone. See, after cocking about with the sands in the last game, the prince is now being endlessly pursued by an unkillable demon called the Dahaka, who wants to kill him for messing up the timeline, which I suppose would put a downer on anyone's day, to be fair. So the prince travels to the island of time where the sands were created in order to travel back and stop them ever being made. In terms of gameplay, this game improves on everything from the last game, and crucially, just to get it out of the way, a controller will work perfectly with this once you've reassigned all the buttons, because for some reason the default setting had start as the attack button. Yeah. Oh, and the tutorial button issue is still present, but from the way the instructions are worded, you can still figure out what buttons it means from the context. Other than that, it controls perfectly. The combat is much more acrobatic, incorporating wall attacks, spinning around columns, two-handed attack combos, basically just more variety. Like before, give an enemy an opening and they can stun lock you until half your health is gone, but the combat is much less repetitive here, with the dog enemies being the only really boring or annoying ones to fight. But the big new mechanic here is the time travel portals. Every so often you'll come across a portal that, you guessed it, lets you travel backwards or forwards in time. What this means in terms of gameplay is that you have to go through areas again that you've already completed, but this time it will be in either its former glory or in its current decrepit state. Obviously this is a linear game, so you won't ever be left guessing as to which time period you need to be in to continue along, but it is pretty cool to be able to see what the ancient ruins you've just been climbing all over looked like back in their heyday. Other than the state of repair in the environment, time travel does create another issue for the prince, at least while he's in the present. That Dahaka demon I mentioned earlier, the unstoppable killing machine of death, will occasionally drop in on the prince while he's in his own time, kicking off a chase sequence which basically forces you to quickly traverse several traps and obstacles until you can escape through a water wall, because sand monsters don't like water, you see. These are pretty nice little sections that do a good job of reminding you why the prince is hopping between times like he is, because if he can't sort his mess out, this big angry black thing will kill him. About 3/4 of the way through the game you find a mask that turns you into a sand wraith. What this means is that your health is constantly depleting at a slow rate, at least down to about 20%, but your sand tanks always refill automatically. I really like this section of the game as it lets you play with the sand combat abilities a lot more and lets you feel pretty powerful for the final chunk of the game. Plus the way he looks in this form reminding me of Legacy of Kain for some reason, and anything that reminds me of that game must be a good thing. The other thing that this game introduces that the previous game didn't is boss battles. Now these usually amount to little more than holding block until the enemy finishes their attack animation before getting a few hits in, and then repeating that until they die. But there are a couple which throw unfamiliar attack types at you, like sand tornadoes or a giant griffin thing that will dive bomb you. There's also a hidden final boss and an alternate ending if you manage to find all of the health upgrades scattered around the game, which I didn't, but that ending is on YouTube, so you don't have to go through all that effort just to see that ending, which is good because according to the next game, that ending is the proper one. Which brings us nicely to the final game in the trilogy, The Two Thrones. Gone are the distorted guitar riffs and guyliner, and back are the Arabian themed songs and slightly lighter tone. Turns out that in the official storyline, the Sands of Time are created by the death of the Empress of Time, Kylena, and so at the end of the last game you spared her and brought her back to Babylon to get jiggy with. Although with her being made of sand, I can't imagine that being very comfortable or hygienic. But anyway, it turns out that because the sands were never created, the Vizier, who was the main bad guy from the first game, has invaded Babylon and is currently tearing through the city, causing a bit of a mess. Kylena is captured and then sacrificed by the Vizier, turning him into some sort of half-man, half-floating sand beetle demon thing, and luckily enough giving you back your ability to manipulate time. Personally, I think that this game gets the best part of the two games that came before it. It has the combat of the second game coupled with the tone of the first, with some extra bits sprinkled on top to make it its own thing. There are new traversal mechanics such as springboards and life climbing, and there is the Dark Prince living inside the prince's head. See, when Kylena is killed and the Sands of Time are created, the prince gets some of the sand in an open wound in his arm, which creates a darker version of himself in his own head. For most of the game, the prince will have conversations with his darker self, discussing each other's motives or their opinions on what's going on, or just ethical discussions. But during certain sections, the Dark Prince will take over, transforming the prince into the physical manifestation of his darkest self. During these sections, you can use a rather overpowered chain weapon, which I imagine they only included because God of War was a pretty big deal at the time, and obviously that must have been because it had chain weapons in it. But to counter your overpowered attacks, you now lose health continuously, but you could refill it by collecting sand, which is typically found inside of enemies. These sections also give you a couple of new traversal mechanics, which are both basically using your chain weapon to swing off stuff to either jump or wall run further. These sections are relatively infrequent and not very long, and the constantly depleting health does create some tension, but I just wish it worked more like the Sand Wraith sections from Warrior Within and had your sand tanks refill automatically, just to make you feel a bit more powerful in this form, which is supposed to be the darker, unleashed version of the prince. Boss battles also make a return here, but with each one having some sort of gimmick to it, and I don't mean that in a bad way. Rather than just being a straight fight against an enemy with a lot of HP, you usually have to reverse the environment to get a good vantage point to expose their weak points. One battle that held me up for a bit was a fight against two tough enemies within a ring of fire. You had to attack one to cause the other one to attempt a heavy attack, which would expose him for a while if you missed. This is one of those fights where getting cocky could cost you 80% of your health bar. There's also a couple of chariot sections and a section where you ride on top of a giant creature sprinting through some massive corridors. These are weird additions to the game. Neither the vehicle handles particularly well, and they end up just being a whole section of trial and error until you complete it, and they only really serve to allow the story to progress a bit quicker by getting you from A to B more quickly. I did really enjoy this game, but I had two major issues with it. One was, as with the first game, a controller issue. This game works just as well as Warrior Within on a gamepad, except this one also has the proper button configuration by default, and the correct button prompts are displayed in tutorial messages. Fantastic! Yeah, except for a little problem tied to the left analog stick. Sometimes, in fact most of the time, if you aren't using the left movement stick, the prince will start walking slowly in some random direction. A lot of the time this isn't much of a problem, and even when you're moving it isn't a problem at all, but when you're lining up a jump or inching closer to an edge, he will start creeping off somewhere like he's had enough and hopes you won't notice him leaving. This is especially a problem when pressing the jump button to pull yourself up a ledge, as he may decide instead to just leap backwards to his death, either costing you a sand tank to rewind him back up or forcing you to restart from a checkpoint. And when you're trying to keep his balance on a beam, you end up having to compensate for the controller trying to walk him off to the side. Maybe there's a mod out there to fix this, but no amount of calibration on my part could solve the problem. But that's not a game breaker, just a bit of a consistent annoyance, so I soldiered on, right up until that other major issue. Now, I hadn't played this game since God knows when, I think it was 2006 or something, but I did know that the section of the game being shown here is right near the end of the game. This is about half an hour away from the final boss. I got to this section, swinging off here, off that springboard, and oh, I missed it. Okay, well then let's have another go at it. Oh, I missed it again. And again. And again. And now I've run out of sand tanks, so I better make it this. Oh. Checkpoint restart, repeat the last 10 minutes. 2 more attempts? No. Check a YouTube walkthrough video to make sure this is the right way. Yep, that guy did it first time, the bastard. 4 more attempts, all failed. Checkpoint restart. Fuck this. Fuck it right in the ear. I quit. I'm done. Bollocks. If it wasn't for those 2 problems, or really just that last one, I would say that the Two Thrones is the best game in the series. It takes the best of the both games that came before it and added enough to make it mechanically and in terms of story, in my opinion, the best of the bunch. And if you still have a PS2 and can get copies of all 3 games, then that will still be the case. But if you're buying them off Steam like I did, then I have to say that Warrior Within is the best game. Purely because it works properly, and the small little thing I look for in games that you can actually complete it. That said, all of these games are better than the 2008 reboot, even the game you can't complete. And playing them cemented the reason why for me. In these games, your oops let's try that again ability is limited. You could run out of it, which will cause you to have to restart an area if you run out of sand. tough, get good, etc. In the 2008 game, this ability is infinite and instant, removing any sense of threat or peril or punishment. Couple that with traversal being nothing more than holding forward and pressing jump when you get to a ledge or a beam, and you've got a pretty easy time on your hands. It removed any challenge. In these older games, you can fail if you miss time a wall run jump, or if you don't stick your knife in the hole in time, or if you start running at a moving buzzsaw too late, and you lose some of your resources from making that mistake. The 2008 game is clearly a product of a boardroom meeting trying to figure out how to make the game as accessible as possible, rather than worrying about giving fans of the series something that they can get stuck into and enjoy. It's a shame that some games aren't made out of passion anymore, and they're instead made purely to milk money or to push some sort of political agenda onto people. So it's a good job the indie scene is so prevalent these days, eh?